The dust devils danced across the main street of Cedar Ridge, spinning their wild ballet through the scorched afternoon air. It was the kind of day that made men pull their hats low and women clutch their shawls tight, though the heat pressed down like a flat iron on everything it touched. The year was 1870, and the frontier town sat like a stubborn mule on the edge of civilization, refusing to budge despite the harshness that surrounded it. Jacob Hart stood on the wooden platform of the train station, his calloused hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the empty tracks stretching eastward. The metal rails shimmered in the heat, creating mirages that looked like pools of water in the distance. He'd been standing there for the better part of an hour, his patience wearing thin as sweat trickled down his back beneath his work shirt. At 32, Jacob was what the frontier had made him: lean, weathered, and practical to his core. His face bore the marks of a man who'd seen too much sun and not enough mercy, with deep lines etched around gray eyes that had witnessed both beauty and brutality in equal measure. He owned a modest ranch 15 miles north of town, carved out of stubborn land that fought him for every blade of grass and drop of water. The decision to take a mail-order bride hadn't come easily. For 3 years now, since Mary had died of the fever, he'd managed alone, but a ranch needed more than one pair of hands, and the loneliness had started to seep into his bones like winter cold. When old Samuel at the general store mentioned the matrimonial agency back east, Jacob had listened with the same practical consideration he gave to buying seed or selecting cattle. He'd been specific in his letter to the agency: send a plain, hard-working woman. He'd written in his careful script, one who understands the frontier life ain't easy, don't need beauty or fancy education, just someone steady who can handle the isolation and the work. He'd sealed that letter with wax and the certainty of a man who knew exactly what he needed, or thought he did. The train's whistle pierced the afternoon quiet, a lonely sound that echoed off the distant mesas. Black smoke appeared on the horizon, and Jacob straightened his shoulders, running a hand through his dark hair to smooth it down. He'd put on his best shirt, the blue one with only 2 patches, and had even trimmed his beard that morning. A man should look respectable when meeting his bride, even if the marriage was more business arrangement than romance. As the locomotive thundered into the station, bringing with it the smell of coal smoke and hot metal, Jacob felt his stomach tighten. He'd sent the money for her passage 2 months ago, along with a brief letter introducing himself. Her name was Eleanor Walsh, originally from Philadelphia. The agency had assured him she was a sensible woman of modest appearance and gentle temperament, eager for the honest work of frontier life. The train shuddered to a stop, steam hissing from its sides like an angry snake. Passengers began to disembark, a few traveling merchants, a family with 3 small children, an elderly couple moving slow as molasses. Jacob's eyes scanned each face, looking for a woman who matched his expectations. Plain dress, modest bonnet, perhaps carrying a worn carpet bag. Someone who would blend into the landscape of his life without causing ripples. Then he saw her. She stood at the top of the train steps, pausing as if the western sun had struck her like a physical blow. But it wasn't the sun that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. It was the woman herself. Her hair, instead of being properly pinned beneath a bonnet, tumbled around her shoulders in waves the color of autumn wheat, wild and untamed despite obvious attempts to control it. She wore a traveling dress of deep green that had seen better days, but the way she carried herself made it look like a queen's robes. It was her eyes that held him, though they were the color of sage honey, flecked with gold, and they swept across the platform with an intensity that suggested she was cataloging every detail, measuring every person and possibility. When those eyes found his, Jacob felt something shift in his chest, like a fence post finally giving way after years of standing firm. She descended the steps with a grace that seemed at odds with the dusty frontier setting, though he noticed she gripped the railing tight, betraying a nervousness her lifted chin didn't show. A single carpet bag hung from her other hand, looking too fine for the rough journey she must have endured. Jacob forced his feet to move, closing the distance between them with measured steps. Up close, He could see the dust of travel on her dress, the weariness in the shadows beneath those remarkable eyes. But there was something else there too, a wildness, like a Mustang that had been corralled but never truly broken. "Miss Walsh?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "Mr. Hart." It wasn't a question. She studied him with those penetrating eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she could see straight through to his soul. "I suppose you're disappointed." The directness of her words caught him off guard. "I'm sorry." A smile played at the corner of her mouth, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I read your letter to the agency. You requested someone plain. I'm afraid I'm a terrible disappointment in that regard." Jacob found himself without words. A rare occurrence. He'd expected meekness, deference, perhaps even gratitude. This woman, Eleanor, stood before him like she was doing him a favor by being there. Despite the dust on her dress and the obvious exhaustion in her posture, "I expected a plain frontier bride," he finally managed, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. But the rest of his thoughts, about rules and expectations and the careful life he'd built, dissolved under her steady gaze. "Yes, well," she said, hefting her carpetbag with a small grunt of effort. "I expected a great many things too. Mr. Hart, it seems we're both in for surprises." She glanced around the shabby town with its false front buildings and dirt streets. "Is it far to your ranch?" 15 miles, he answered automatically, still trying to reconcile the woman before him with the modest bride he'd imagined. "I brought the wagon." "Then perhaps we should go," Eleanor said, practical despite her appearance. "I've been on that train for 5 days, and I'd very much like to stop moving, even if it means starting a new kind of journey." There was something in the way she said it, journey, that made Jacob wonder what she was really running from. But he'd learned long ago that everyone on the frontier was running from something. It was what they ran toward that mattered. He reached for her carpetbag, and their fingers brushed in the transfer. Her hands weren't the soft, white hands of a pampered Eastern lady, as he'd feared when he first saw her. There were calluses there, faint but present, and her grip was firm. "This way," he said, leading her toward where he'd left the wagon and team. The horses stamped their feet impatiently, eager to be moving despite the heat. As he helped Eleanor up onto the bench seat, he caught the scent of her. Lavender soap mixed with train smoke and something else. Something wild, like sage after rain. She settled her skirts with practiced movements, then looked at him expectantly. "Well, Mr. Hart, I believe we have a marriage to attend to before we leave town. Unless frontier customs are different than I was led to believe, of course." The marriage. In his stunned state, he'd nearly forgotten the practical matter that had brought them together. "The Justice of the Peace has an office above the general store," he said, climbing up beside her. As he took up the reins, Jacob caught sight of their reflection in the window of the bank, him in his patched shirt and worn hat, her with her wild beauty barely contained by civilization's trappings. They looked mismatched, like a sparrow paired with a hawk. "Mr. Hart?" Eleanor's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you having second thoughts?" He turned to look at her directly, taking in the proud tilt of her chin, the way her hands gripped each other tightly in her lap, the only sign of her own uncertainty. "No, Miss Walsh," he said finally, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Though I'll admit, you're not what I expected." "Good," she said, and this time her smile was real, transforming her face from merely beautiful to something that made his chest tight. "I've found that expectations are rather like rules. They're made to be shattered." As Jacob guided the horses toward the general store, he wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd wanted a simple frontier bride to share the work and warm his bed. Someone who would fit into his life without disturbing the careful order he'd built from the ashes of his grief. Instead, he'd gotten Eleanor Walsh, with her wild hair and fierce eyes and hints of secrets he couldn't begin to guess. The practical part of him knew he should be worried. But another part, a part he'd thought dead with Mary, stirred to life like spring grass after a hard winter. The frontier had taught Jacob Hart many lessons about survival, about bending with the harsh winds rather than breaking. But as he helped his unexpected bride down from the wagon to make their union official, he had the feeling she was about to teach him something else entirely, something about being truly alive. The wagon wheels groaned in protest as they navigated the rutted trail leading north from Cedar Ridge. The landscape stretched before them like a canvas painted in shades of brown and red, broken only by scattered juniper trees clinging stubbornly to life. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the dried grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Jacob kept his eyes on the trail ahead, acutely aware of the woman sitting beside him. Eleanor, his wife now, strange as that thought was, had said little since they'd left the justice of the peace. The ceremony had been brief, practical, witnessed by the store clerk and his wife. Eleanor had spoken her vows in a clear voice, her hand steady in his, though he'd noticed the slight tremor in her fingers when he'd slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. Jacob stole glances at her from beneath the brim of his hat, watching how she took in the harsh landscape. Most Eastern women would have been wilting by now, complaining about the dust or the heat or the bone-jarring ride. Eleanor sat straight-backed, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was reading a map only she could see. "It's beautiful," she said suddenly, causing him to start slightly, in a fierce sort of way. Jacob followed her gaze to where a red-tailed hawk circled lazily above a distant mesa. "Most folks find it too harsh," he replied carefully. "Most folks prefer their beauty tamed," Eleanor said, a slight edge to her voice. "Gardens with neat rows, mountains viewed from hotel verandas. But this," she gestured at the raw expanse around them. "This is honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." There was something in her tone that made Jacob wonder again what had driven her west. The matrimonial agency had provided only basic information, age 26, educated, of good family. But good families didn't usually send their daughters to marry strangers on the frontier. "Reckon you'll feel different come winter," he said, testing. "Temperature drops below freezing. Snow piles up higher than a horse's belly. Nothing beautiful about trying to keep cattle alive when the wind cuts through you like a blade." She turned to look at him fully then, and he was struck again by those honey-colored eyes. "Mr. Hart, Jacob," she corrected herself, though the informal name sat awkwardly on her tongue. "Do you think I came here expecting comfort?" "I don't rightly know what to think," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "Your letter to the agency said you were seeking a new start. That could mean a lot of things." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently twisting the gold band on her finger. "My father owned a shipping company in Philadelphia," she said finally. "A very successful one. He had very specific ideas about what his daughter's life should look like, who she should marry, how she should behave, what accomplishments were appropriate for a lady of standing." She paused, and Jacob waited, sensing there was more. "I disappointed him," she continued, her voice carefully neutral. "I had opinions. I read books he didn't approve of. I attended lectures on subjects deemed inappropriate for women. And when he arranged a marriage to his business partner, a man 30 years my senior who'd already buried 2 wives, I refused." The wagon hit a deep rut, jostling them both. Jacob steadied the horses, using the moment to process her words. "So you answered an advertisement for a frontier bride instead?" "It seemed a fair trade," Eleanor said with a slight shrug. "Your letter was honest. You needed a partner, not an ornament. Someone to work beside you, not simply to grace your parlor. I may not know much about ranching, but I'm not afraid of hard work." "The agency said you were of gentle temperament," Jacob said dryly, "eager for frontier life." Eleanor's laugh was unexpected, rich and genuine. "I paid the agency clerk to write that. I assumed you wouldn't want a bride who'd been essentially disowned for being too spirited." Despite himself, Jacob felt his lips twitch toward a smile. Spirited, that's one word for it. They traveled in more comfortable silence for a while. The rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and steady clop of hooves creating a frontier melody. The landscape began to change subtly, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with piñón pines. In the distance, Jacob could make out the dark line of the creek that bordered his property, one of the reasons he'd chosen this particular piece of land. "Tell me about the ranch," Eleanor said as they crested a small rise. Jacob considered his words. "It's not much compared to what you're used to. 640 acres, though only about half is good grazing land. I run about 50 head of cattle, a dozen horses. The house is solid. I built it myself, but it's simple. 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen." "You built it yourself?" There was genuine interest in her voice. "Had help raising the walls and roof," he admitted. "But yeah, most of it. Came out here 5 years ago with—" He stopped abruptly, not ready to talk about Mary yet. Eleanor didn't press, for which he was grateful. Instead, she asked, "What made you choose this place?" "Water," Jacob said simply. "That creek runs year-round, even in drought years. Water's life out here. You can have all the land in the world, but without water, it's just dirt." As if to emphasize his point, they passed the skeleton of a failed homestead, its collapsed walls and broken dreams a testament to the frontier's unforgiving nature. Eleanor studied it with those penetrating eyes, and Jacob wondered what she saw, a warning or a challenge. "There," he said as they topped the final hill. "That's home." The ranch house sat in a natural bowl of land, protected from the worst of the wind by a line of cottonwoods that followed the creek. It was exactly as he'd described. Simple, solid, unadorned. The barn stood to the east, its weathered boards silver in the late afternoon light. A small corral held several horses, their heads turning curiously at the wagon's approach. "It's perfect," Eleanor said softly, and something in her tone made Jacob look at her sharply. She wasn't mocking or being polite. She was studying his ranch with the same intensity she'd given the landscape, as if memorizing every detail. "You haven't seen the inside yet," he warned. "Like I said, it's basic. No fancy furniture or curtains or—" "Jacob," she interrupted, using his given name with more confidence this time. "I didn't come here for fancy." As they pulled up to the house, the dogs came running, 2 mixed-breed shepherds who served as both companions and working animals. They barked at Eleanor, suspicious of the stranger, until Jacob quieted them with a word. "This is Boss," he said, indicating the larger of the 2, a grizzled male with intelligent eyes. "And that's Lady. Don't let the name fool you. She's tougher than most men I know." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help, though he noticed she moved stiffly after the long ride. She extended her hand toward the dogs, letting them sniff her fingers. Lady, ever the cautious one, gave a tentative tail wag. "I've never had dogs," Eleanor said, a note of wonder in her voice. "Father thought them dirty and common." "Out here, they're necessary," Jacob said, lifting her carpet bag from the wagon bed. "They'll warn you of strangers, help with the cattle, keep the coyotes at bay." Eleanor's head snapped up. Coyotes, among other things. He decided not to mention the mountain lions just yet. "Come on, I'll show you the house." The interior was exactly what he'd promised, basic but clean. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. His few pieces of furniture were handmade and functional. The bedroom door stood open, revealing a simple iron bedstead and washstand. Eleanor moved through the space slowly, running her fingers along surfaces, peering out the windows at the views they offered. She paused at the shelf that held his small collection of books, a Bible, an almanac, a worn copy of Shakespeare's collected works that had been Mary's. "You read?" she asked, surprise coloring her voice. "When I have time," Jacob said, feeling defensive. "Winter nights are long out here." "I didn't mean—" Eleanor turned to face him, her expression earnest. "I'm pleased, that's all. I brought some books of my own. I was worried they'd seem frivolous." "What kind of books?" "Poetry, mostly, some philosophy, a natural history of the Western Territories that's probably wholly inaccurate but fascinating nonetheless. She paused. Are you scandalized? By books. Jacob shook his head. Takes more than that to scandalize a frontier man. Mrs. Hart. The use of her new name seemed to remind them both of the strangeness of their situation. The sun was setting now, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. Soon it would be dark, and they would have to navigate the delicate matter of their wedding night. I'll see to the horses, Jacob said abruptly. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. I'll bring in your bag. He escaped to the familiar routine of unhitching the team, grateful for the simple, physical task. The horses knew their business, moving eagerly toward the corral and the promise of feed and water. As he worked, Jacob tried to sort through his jumbled thoughts. Eleanor Walsh, Eleanor Hart now, was nothing like what he'd expected. Where he'd anticipated meekness, she showed strength. Where he'd wanted simplicity, she brought complexity and her beauty. He'd specifically asked for plain because beautiful women meant trouble. They had expectations, demands. They upset the natural order of things. But as he glanced back at the house, seeing lamplight flicker to life in the window, Jacob had to admit that Eleanor didn't seem interested in using her beauty as a weapon. If anything, she seemed to wear it like an inconvenience, something that had caused her more trouble than advantage. When he finally returned to the house, he found her at the stove, competently building up the fire. She'd changed from her traveling dress into something simpler, a brown skirt and white blouse that looked more suitable for work. Her wild hair was braided now, though rebellious strands still escaped to frame her face. I thought I'd make coffee, she said without turning. Though I should warn you, my domestic skills are somewhat theoretical. That natural history book I mentioned, I've read it 3 times. Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management? Perhaps once, under duress. Coffee's not complicated, Jacob said, moving to show her where he kept the supplies. And cooking out here is mostly about making do with what you have. They worked together to prepare a simple meal, beans and cornbread, with some preserved peaches for dessert. Eleanor asked questions about everything. Where supplies came from, how often he went to town, what vegetables grew in the kitchen garden he'd pointed out. The ranch is more self-sufficient than I expected, she said as they sat down to eat. Has to be, Jacob replied. Town's a half-day's ride in good weather, longer if the creek floods or snow blocks the pass. You learn to depend on yourself out here. Eleanor absorbed this information with the same intensity she'd shown all day. What happened to your first wife? She asked suddenly. If you don't mind my asking. Jacob's hand stilled halfway to his coffee cup. Fever. 3 years ago. She went quick. 3 days from first symptom to... He cleared his throat. It was a bad summer. The fever took a lot of folks. I'm sorry, Eleanor said simply. Was it a love match? The question surprised him. I suppose so. We grew up in the same town back in Missouri. Got married young, came west together. Mary was a good woman. Gentle, kind. Everything a wife should be. Unlike me, Eleanor said. But there was no self-pity in it. Just observation. Jacob studied her across the rough table. I don't know what you are yet, he said honestly. But I'm beginning to think that's not a bad thing. As darkness settled fully over the ranch, they cleaned up together, moving around each other in the small space with careful courtesy. The night sounds of the frontier began, coyotes howling in the distance, an owl calling from the cottonwoods, the endless whisper of wind through grass. Finally, they could delay no longer. Eleanor stood by the bedroom door, her chin lifted in that characteristic gesture he was already beginning to recognize as defensive courage. I know my duties as a wife, she said quietly. I'm not some sheltered innocent, despite what my father preferred to believe. Jacob felt heat rise in his neck. This was not a conversation he'd prepared for. Eleanor, but I hope, she continued, her voice steady despite the color in her cheeks, that we might take time to know each other first, This marriage may have begun as a practical arrangement, but I'd like to think we could build something more, in time. The relief Jacob felt was mixed with something else. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. Here was someone else who understood that the best things took time to grow, like crops in difficult soil. Time we have plenty of, he said gently. You take the bedroom. I'll bunk out here for now. We'll figure things out as we go. The gratitude in her eyes was quickly masked, but he saw it. Thank you, Jacob, for understanding. As she retreated to the bedroom, Jacob settled into his makeshift bed by the fireplace. Through the thin walls, he could hear her moving about, the rustle of fabric, the splash of water in the basin. Such intimate sounds, reminding him that his carefully ordered life was forever changed. He thought about her words, that expectations were made to be shattered. Maybe she was right. Maybe the careful rules he'd built around his heart, the boundaries he'd drawn to keep pain at bay, weren't protection but prison bars. Outside, a coyote howled again, closer this time. Lady growled softly from her spot by the door. The frontier was teaching Eleanor its first lesson, that danger was always present, always waiting. But as Jacob drifted toward sleep, he wondered if the real danger hadn't already walked through his door, wearing a green dress and carrying a carpet bag full of philosophy books. A danger to the quiet, half-dead life he'd been living since Mary died. A beautiful, wild danger that might just save him, if it didn't destroy him first. The rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn darkness, but Eleanor was already awake. She'd been lying in the narrow bed for the past hour, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch coming to life. The lowing of cattle, the nickering of horses, the creak of the windmill drawing water. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jacob moving about, the careful quiet of a man trying not to disturb. She rose and dressed quickly in the dim light filtering through the single window. The morning air was sharp with the promise of another hot day, carrying scents she was still learning to identify, sage, dust, and something wild she couldn't yet name. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her blouse, still clumsy from sleep and the strangeness of her new life. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Jacob already gone, the door standing open to the morning. A pot of coffee sat warming on the stove, and beside it, a note in his careful hand. Gone to check the herd, back by breakfast. Eleanor poured herself a cup of the bitter brew and stepped onto the narrow porch. The landscape that had seemed merely harsh yesterday now revealed itself in the pearl-gray light of dawn. The red mesas caught the first rays of sun like altar candles, and the creek sparkled silver through the cottonwoods. It was beautiful in the way a weapon could be beautiful, functional, dangerous, honest. Boss and Lady emerged from wherever they'd spent the night, tails wagging cautiously. Eleanor extended her hand as she'd done yesterday, letting them reacquaint themselves with her scent. I suppose you know more about running this place than I do, she murmured to Lady, who tilted her head as if considering this truth. In the distance, she could see a figure on horseback, Jacob, moving among the cattle with an ease that spoke of long practice. Even from here, she could see the way he sat his horse, the economic grace of someone who'd learned that wasted motion meant wasted energy. Eleanor finished her coffee and surveyed her new domain. The kitchen garden Jacob had mentioned was a small patch of worked earth near the house, protected by a rough fence that had seen better days. She could identify what might be beans, some struggling tomato plants, and what looked like herbs gone mostly to seed. Well, she said to the dogs, no time like the present to prove I'm not completely useless. She found a bucket and hauled water from the well, marveling at how heavy it became over the 20 yards to the garden. In Philadelphia, water had appeared at the turn of a tap, like magic. Here, every drop was earned through effort. The sun climbed higher as she worked, pulling weeds and trying to determine which plants were intentional and which were interlopers. Her hands, already bearing faint calluses from her secret attempts at gardening back home, one of many small rebellions against her father's expectations, began to blister anew. Sweat trickled down her back, making her blouse stick uncomfortably. You'll want to water in the evening, not the heat of the day." Eleanor started, turning to find Jacob watching her from atop his horse. She hadn't heard him approach. "The water," he continued, dismounting with fluid ease, "evaporates too fast in this sun. Evening watering lets it soak in overnight." "Oh." Eleanor felt foolish, like a child caught playing at being grown. "I didn't think—" "How could you? It's different here." He tied his horse to the porch rail and joined her by the garden. "Though I appreciate the effort. This patch has been neglected since, well, for a while now." Eleanor heard what he didn't say. Since Mary died. She wondered how many other corners of the ranch carried such ghosts. "I've been thinking," Jacob said, crouching to examine a tomato plant. "If you're serious about learning the work, we should start with the animals. Horses first. If something happens to me, you'll need to be able to ride for help." The casual way he mentioned something happening to him sent a chill through Eleanor despite the warming day. "All right," she said, matching his matter-of-fact tone. "When do we start?" "Now, if you're willing, but first, breakfast. And you'll need different clothes. What you're wearing is fine for gardening, but around horses and cattle." He gestured vaguely at her skirts. After a quick meal of biscuits and the last of the preserved peaches, Eleanor found herself standing in the barn, wearing a pair of Jacob's old trousers cinched tight with rope and one of his shirts tied at the waist. The clothes smelled of hay and honest sweat, and she felt both ridiculous and strangely free. "My father would have an apoplectic fit," she muttered, testing the range of motion the trousers allowed. "Your father's not here," Jacob said simply, "and divided skirts are safer around horses. Now, this is Pepper." He led forward a bay mare with a white blaze. "She's gentle but not lazy, perfect for learning." What followed was an education in more than just horsemanship. As Jacob showed her how to approach the horse, how to run her hands along Pepper's neck to check for injuries, how to lift each hoof to inspect for stones, Eleanor began to understand the rhythm of ranch life. Everything connected. The health of the horses affected the ability to work cattle, which affected the ranch's survival. "You're not afraid," Jacob observed as Eleanor confidently picked up Pepper's rear hoof. "Most city folks are nervous around animals this size. I used to sneak into the livery stables near our house," Eleanor admitted. "The stable boys taught me a little, though nothing this thorough. Father would have been furious if he'd known." "Seems like your father had a lot of opinions about what you shouldn't do." "He had a vision," Eleanor said, setting down Pepper's hoof carefully. "A proper daughter who would marry well and increase the family's social standing. Instead, he got me." Jacob handed her a curry brush. His loss. The simple statement, delivered without fanfare, warmed Eleanor more than elaborate compliments might have. They worked in companionable silence, Jacob correcting her technique occasionally, but mostly letting her find her own way. By midday, Eleanor had learned to saddle and bridle Pepper. Though her arms ached from lifting the heavy saddle, Jacob had her lead the mare around the corral, teaching her to read the horse's body language, to anticipate reactions before they happened. "You're a natural," he said as she successfully navigated Pepper around a series of obstacles he'd set up. "Ready to try riding?" Eleanor's heart jumped, but she nodded. With Jacob's steady presence beside her, she mounted, awkwardly at first, grateful for the trousers that made it possible. The ground seemed very far away. "Breathe," Jacob said, his hand on Pepper's bridle. "She can feel if you're tense. Horses are mirrors. They reflect what you're feeling." It took several circuits of the corral before Eleanor began to relax, to find the rhythm of the mare's walk. Jacob walked alongside at first, then stepped back, letting her control the horse alone. When she successfully guided Pepper through a figure-8 pattern, she couldn't suppress a laugh of pure delight. "I did it." "You did," Jacob agreed, and she was surprised to see him actually smiling, not just the slight twitch of lips she'd noticed before, but a real smile that transformed his weathered features. "Tomorrow we'll try a trot." As Eleanor dismounted, her legs shaky from the unfamiliar exercise, A cloud of dust on the southern horizon caught their attention. Jacob's expression immediately sharpened, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle, always within reach. Riders coming. 3, maybe 4. He studied the dust with experienced eyes. Get to the house. But, Eleanor. His voice brooked no argument. We don't know who they are. Get to the house. Bolt the door. And don't come out unless I call for you. Eleanor wanted to protest. She hadn't come west to hide behind doors. But the tension in Jacob's body told her this wasn't the time for debate. She walked quickly to the house, Lady following unbidden, and did as instructed. Through the window, she watched Jacob check his rifle, then stand waiting in the yard, deceptively casual. The riders materialized from the dust. 4 men, hard-faced and trail-worn. Eleanor didn't need frontier experience to recognize trouble when she saw it. These weren't neighbors paying a social call. Hart, the lead rider called, reining up just outside what seemed to be an invisible boundary. Heard you got yourself a new woman. News travels, Jacob replied, his voice carrying clearly to the house. What brings you to my land? Dalton? Dalton, a name Eleanor filed away. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with mean eyes that swept the ranch with proprietary interest. Just being neighborly, Dalton said with a smile that didn't reach those cold eyes. Thought we'd welcome your bride proper-like. She's not receiving visitors today. That's unfriendly. Hart, we rode all this way. Then you can ride all the way back. Jacob's rifle shifted slightly, still pointed at the ground, but ready. You're not welcome here. Dalton, weren't before, aren't now. One of the other riders, younger and clearly itching for trouble, started to speak, but Dalton held up a hand. Now, Hart, let's not forget who controls the water rights upstream. Would be a shame if your creek ran dry come drought season. My water rights are legal and recorded. You try to dam that creek. We'll settle it in court. Courts are far away, Dalton observed. Lot can happen between here and there. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, her hand gripping the windowsill until her knuckles went white. She'd read about range disputes in that natural history book, but the reality was far more menacing than dry text had conveyed. Get off my land, Jacob said quietly. Don't come back. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Dalton laughed, an ugly sound that made Lady growl low in her throat. We'll be seeing you, Hart, you and your pretty new wife. He touched his hat in a mockery of courtesy, then wheeled his horse around. The others followed, whooping and spurring their mounts into unnecessary speed, leaving another cloud of dust in their wake. Jacob stood watching until they disappeared over the rise, then walked slowly to the house. Eleanor met him at the door. Who were they? Trouble, Jacob said tersely. Dalton owns the Double D ranch south of here, biggest spread in the valley. He's been trying to push out the smaller ranchers for years, buy up land cheap. And if people won't sell? Jacob's expression was grim. Accidents happen, creeks get dammed, cattle disappear, barns catch fire. Eleanor felt a chill despite the heat. The sheriff? The sheriff's in town, a half-day's ride away. By the time he gets here, evidence has a way of disappearing. Jacob set his rifle back in its place by the door. This is what I meant yesterday. The frontier's not just harsh weather and hard work. There are men like Dalton who think might makes right. You stood up to him. Had to show weakness to men like that. They'll take everything. He looked at her then, really looked at her. This is the life you've chosen. Eleanor, it's not too late. We could annul the marriage. I could send you back. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I didn't run from one bully just to flee from another. If this Dalton thinks he can intimidate me, he's gravely mistaken. Something shifted in Jacob's expression. You might just survive out here after all, Mrs. Hart. They spent the afternoon working closer to the house, Jacob teaching her to shoot the old Spencer rifle he kept for her protection. Eleanor's arms, already sore from the morning's work, protested at the weapon's weight, but she gritted her teeth and persevered. By the 20th shot, She could hit the makeshift target more often than not. "You're pulling right," Jacob observed, standing close enough that she could smell the leather and sweat scent of him. "Anticipating the recoil. Let it surprise you." Eleanor tried again, forcing herself to squeeze the trigger without tensing. The shot hit dead center. "Better," Jacob said, and she heard approval in his voice. "We'll practice every day until it's second nature. Out here, everyone needs to know how to defend themselves." As the sun began its descent, painting the mesas in shades of copper and gold, they worked together to bring in the horses and secure the barn. Eleanor's body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were blistered despite the gloves Jacob had found for her, and her fine skin was already showing signs of sun exposure. She'd never felt more alive. At dinner, a simple stew Jacob had started that morning, Eleanor found herself ravenous in a way she'd never experienced in Philadelphia's polite society. They ate in comfortable silence, the day's shared work having built a bridge between them that words might not have managed. "I should check on the cattle at the far pasture tomorrow," Jacob said as they cleaned up. "It's a full day's ride. I could put it off." "No," Eleanor interrupted. "Don't change your routine for me. I'll be fine." Jacob studied her, and she could see him weighing his responsibilities against leaving her alone so soon. "You remember what I taught you about the rifle?" "Yes, and if Dalton or his men come back, I bar the door and don't let them in. If they persist, I fire a warning shot. If they still persist—" She met his eyes steadily. "I aim center mass and squeeze. Don't pull." A ghost of that rare smile touched his lips. "You might just do." Eleanor Hart. Later, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Her hair had escaped its braid entirely, forming a wild halo around her sun-touched face. Her white blouse was stained with sweat and dirt. There was a smudge of something, grease from the rifle, perhaps on her cheek. She looked nothing like the properly raised Philadelphia belle she'd been just a week ago. That woman would have been appalled by her appearance, by the ache in her muscles, by the casual way she'd discussed shooting a man over dinner. But as Eleanor studied her reflection, she found herself smiling. For the first time in her life, she looked like herself, not the daughter her father had tried to mold, not the ornament society expected her to be, just Eleanor, learning to survive in a hard land, partnered with a man who valued her strength rather than fearing it. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain that might or might not come. In this land, Eleanor was learning. Promises were as fleeting as morning dew. You took what came and made the best of it. You stood your ground against bullies and learned to shoot straight in water gardens in the evening instead of at noon. You adapted, or you broke. As she lay down in the narrow bed, Eleanor could hear Jacob settling onto his makeshift pallet in the main room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The loneliness of being left alone. The responsibility of the ranch. The constant threat Dalton represented. But tonight, with the rifle within reach and the dogs on guard, she felt something she hadn't expected to find on the frontier. She felt like she was home. The weeks had folded into each other like pages in a book, each one inscribing new calluses on Eleanor's hands and new knowledge in her mind. September had given way to October, bringing cooler mornings and the golden light that made the valley look like a painting. Jacob maintained his careful distance, still sleeping in the main room, still treating her with a courtesy that bordered on formality despite their growing partnership in the ranch's daily work. It was on such a golden evening that trouble arrived. Not with Dalton's blustering threats, but with whispers that slithered through the valley like snakes. Eleanor first noticed it at the general store in Cedar Ridge. She'd ridden in alone, a small victory that had taken weeks of proving herself capable, to purchase supplies. The usual chatter died when she entered, replaced by meaningful looks and hushed voices that resumed the moment she passed. "That'll be $4. "Mrs." Hendricks said, tallying Eleanor's purchases without meeting her eyes. The shopkeeper's wife had always been cool but polite. Today, there was something else in her manner, a judgment that went beyond the usual frontier suspicion of outsiders. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Hendricks?" Eleanor asked, counting out the money. The older woman's mouth pursed like she'd bitten into something sour. "Well enough, I suppose, for those of us who know our place." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, the bell above the door chimed. 3 women entered, wives from neighboring ranches whom Eleanor had met briefly at church the previous Sunday. They took one look at her and huddled together, whispering behind their hands like schoolgirls. "Riding astride like a man. Wearing trousers, I heard thin." "No wonder Jacob Hart keeps her way out there." Eleanor's spine stiffened, but she forced herself to complete her transaction calmly. As she lifted her packages, one of the women, Mrs. Davies, wife of a prosperous cattleman, stepped forward with false sweetness. "Mrs. Hart, how lovely to see you. We were just discussing the upcoming church social. You will be attending, won't you, in proper attire, of course." The emphasis on proper was unmistakable. Eleanor met the woman's eyes steadily. "That depends on how you define proper, Mrs. Davies. If you mean clothing suitable for the life I lead, then yes, I'll be properly attired. My dear, Mrs. Davies's voice dripped condescension. Surely you understand that certain standards must be maintained, even on the frontier. Why, what must poor Mr. Hart think, having a wife who, well..." She gestured vaguely at Eleanor's split skirt and practical boots. "I imagine he thinks he has a wife who can help run his ranch," Eleanor replied evenly. "Which is exactly what he advertised for." "Is it?" Another woman, younger and clearly eager to curry favor with Mrs. Davies, tittered behind her glove. "We heard he advertised for a plain, modest bride, someone who understood frontier proprieties." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Eleanor understood now. Her beauty, which she'd never asked for or wanted, combined with her refusal to play the demure frontier wife, had marked her as a threat. These women saw her as something dangerous, a disruption to their carefully ordered world. "Ladies," Eleanor said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I'm sure you have better things to do than concern yourselves with my marriage. Good day." She left with her head high, but she could feel their stares burning into her back, hear the whispers that erupted before the door even closed behind her. The ride home seemed longer than usual, her mind churning over the encounter. When she reached the ranch, she found Jacob in the barn, mending a harness. He looked up at her entrance, and his expression immediately sharpened. "What happened?" Eleanor set down her packages with more force than necessary. "Apparently, I'm causing a scandal." Jacob's hand stilled on the leather. "How so?" "I wear trousers. I ride astride. I work alongside you instead of sitting in the house doing needlepoint." The words tumbled out, fueled by frustration. "According to the ladies of Cedar Ridge, I'm a disruption to proper frontier society." To her surprise, Jacob's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Is that all?" "All." Eleanor stared at him. "They practically accused me of being improper, unsuitable." Jacob set aside the harness and stood, brushing hay from his pants. "Eleanor, you need to understand something about small communities. They survive on conformity. Everyone knowing their role, playing their part. You," he gestured at her, "don't fit their mold." "I didn't come here to fit into a mold," Eleanor said hotly. "No," Jacob agreed quietly. "You came here to be free, but freedom has a price on the frontier, same as anywhere else." They stood facing each other in the barn's dim light, dust motes dancing between them. Eleanor felt something shift in the air, a tension that had been building for weeks. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Taking me as your wife? I know I'm not what you wanted. Don't—" The word came out rough. Jacob took a step closer, then seemed to catch himself. "Don't put words in my mouth, Eleanor." "Then tell me," she challenged, her heart beating faster. "Tell me what you think when you look at me." For a long moment, Jacob was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, careful. "I think you're the strongest woman I've ever met, I think you work harder than any 2 men I could hire. I think—" He stopped, jaw clenching. What? Eleanor moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. What else do you think? I think, Jacob said slowly, his gray eyes dark with something that made her breath catch, that I've been a fool, trying to keep you at arm's length, trying to follow rules that made sense when I was a different man, living a different life. The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. Jacob! The sound of approaching horses cut through the moment like a knife. Jacob's expression shuddered immediately, the rancher replacing the man who'd almost revealed his heart. He moved past Eleanor to the barn door, his hand automatically checking for the pistol at his hip. Stay here, he ordered, but Eleanor was already beside him, peering into the gathering dusk. 3 riders approached. Not Dalton's men, she realized with relief, but neighbors from the north. Tom Morrison and his sons, their faces grim beneath their wide-brimmed hats. Jacob, Tom called, dismounting heavily. He was a solid man in his 50s, one of the few neighbors who'd been genuinely welcoming to Eleanor. We got trouble. What kind of trouble? Rustlers hit the Baxter place last night, took 30 head, killed young Jim when he tried to stop them. Eleanor heard Jacob's sharp intake of breath. Jim Baxter was barely 17. She knew, a boy trying to fill his dead father's boots. Dalton? Jacob asked. Tom shrugged. No proof, as always, but the tracks led toward Double D land before disappearing at the river. He glanced at Eleanor, touching his hat politely. Ma'am, sorry to bring bad news. We're organizing a watch. Tom's elder son, William, added, taking turns patrolling the valley. Pa thought you should know, being out here alone and all. We're not alone, Eleanor said firmly. We're together. The men exchanged glances, and Eleanor saw a familiar skepticism in their eyes. A woman, even one who could ride and shoot, wasn't considered much protection in their world. I appreciate the warning, Jacob said. We'll keep watch. After the Morrisons left, Jacob and Eleanor worked in tense silence to secure the ranch for the night. They brought the horses into the barn, checked the cattle in the near pasture, ensured all the gates were barred. As darkness fell complete, they found themselves in the main room of the house, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. They'll come for our cattle next, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Probably. Jacob checked his rifle for the 3rd time. Dalton's getting bolder. Killing that boy. He shook his head. There'll be blood over this before it's done. Eleanor moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the darkness that could hide any number of threats. I won't be frightened off, if that's what you're thinking. I wasn't. He turned to look at her, and in the firelight, she could see the worry etched in the lines of his face. But I won't pretend this isn't dangerous. You could go back. No. The word came out fierce. This is my home now. Our home. I won't abandon it because some bully with a big ranch thinks he can take whatever he wants. Something flickered in Jacob's eyes. Pride, perhaps, or recognition. You sound like Mary, he said softly. She had that same fierce streak, though she hid it better. It was the first time he'd voluntarily spoken of his first wife beyond the bare facts. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. She would have liked you, Jacob continued, his voice thoughtful. Oh, she would have been scandalized by the trousers at first, but she would have understood why. She was gentle, like I said, but not weak, never weak. You loved her very much. I did. Jacob's admission was simple, without defensiveness. We built a life together. When she died, I thought— He paused, choosing his words. I thought that part of me died too. The part that could feel anything beyond the work, the survival. Eleanor's heart ached for him, for the pain carved into every line of his body. Without thinking, she reached out, placing her hand over his where it rested on the rifle stock. He went very still. But lately, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, I find myself feeling things I thought were buried with her. Things that scare me more than rustlers or drought or anything else this land can throw at us. Jacob. His name was all she could manage, her throat tight with emotion. He turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. His hands were rough from work, scarred from countless small injuries, but infinitely gentle. "Those women in town are right about one thing," he said. "You are a disruption. You've disrupted everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted. Is that a bad thing?" Instead of answering with words, Jacob lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her chest tight. "No," he said against her skin. "It's terrifying, but it's not bad." They stood there for a long moment, hands clasped, hearts speaking a language their mouths couldn't quite manage yet. Outside, a coyote howled, and the wind whispered secrets through the cottonwoods. Inside, something new and fragile bloomed between them, as delicate as spring grass and as persistent. "We should set a watch," Jacob said finally, though he didn't release her hand. "I'll take first. We'll take it together." Eleanor interrupted. "Partners, remember?" A real smile spread across his face, transforming the harsh plains into something almost boyish. "Partners," he agreed. They spent the night hours on the porch, rifles across their laps, watching the darkness and talking in low voices. Jacob told her about his childhood in Missouri, about coming west with nothing but hope and determination. Eleanor shared stories of her mother, dead when she was 12, who'd secretly encouraged her wild streak. "She gave me a book once," Eleanor recalled, "about women explorers. Father burned it when he found it, but I'd already memorized every word." "Sounds like you come by your rebellion honest," Jacob observed. "Perhaps, though I prefer to think of it as knowing my own mind." As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky, they heard it, the drumming of hooves, many hooves, moving fast across the valley floor. Jacob was on his feet instantly, rifle ready, Eleanor beside him, but the riders passed by, distant shapes heading south toward town. In their wake, they left a dust cloud and questions. "That was from the direction of the Morrison place," Jacob said grimly. They didn't have long to wait for answers. Tom Morrison himself arrived an hour later, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief. "They hit us in the night," he said without preamble. "Killed William when he tried to stop them. Got away with 50 head. Eleanor gasped. William, who'd stood in this very yard just yesterday, young and strong and full of life. "This has to stop," Jacob said, his voice hard as iron. "Agreed." Tom's weathered face was set in granite lines. "We're calling a meeting, tonight at the church, every rancher in the valley. It's time we stood together against Dalton. Proof or no proof." After Tom left, Jacob turned to Eleanor. "This changes things. If we stand against Dalton openly, then we stand against him," Eleanor finished. Together, Jacob studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Together," he echoed. "God help us all." As the sun climbed higher, painting the mesas in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor felt the weight of the choice they were making. The frontier had tested her in ways she'd never imagined, stripping away the soft edges of her old life. But it had also given her something she'd never had, a partner who saw her strength as an asset, not a threat. Standing beside Jacob, looking out at the land they would fight to protect, Eleanor understood that the greatest dangers weren't always rustlers or drought or the harsh judgment of town gossips. Sometimes the greatest danger was in the human heart, in the risk of opening yourself to another person, of building something worth losing. But as Jacob's hand found hers again, strong and steady and sure, Eleanor knew it was a risk worth taking. The frontier had taught her many lessons, but perhaps the most important was this: that love, like the land itself, demanded everything you had to give, and she was ready to give it all. The church meeting had galvanized the valley ranchers into action. For 3 days now, they'd maintained patrols along the property lines, watching for any sign of rustlers. Jacob had taken his turns, leaving Eleanor to manage the ranch alone, a responsibility she'd embraced with fierce determination. Even as worry gnawed at her during his absences, it was during one such patrol that disaster struck. Eleanor was in the barn, tending to Pepper's stone-bruised hoof, when she heard it, the thunder of approaching cattle. Too many and moving too fast. She dropped the hoof-pick and ran to the barn door, her heart sinking at what she saw. A dust cloud was rolling across the southern pasture, and within it, she could make out riders, 4, maybe 5, driving a portion of their herd at breakneck speed toward the canyon that cut through Double D land. Rustlers. In broad daylight, Eleanor didn't think. She grabbed the Spencer rifle from its place by the door and ran for Jacob's horse. Samson, already saddled in the corral for emergencies. The big gelding snorted as she swung aboard, sensing her urgency. "Boss! Lady!" she called, and the dogs came running. "Guard the house!" Then she was spurring Samson into a gallop, the rifle clutched in one hand, reins in the other. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was foolish, that she should ride for help instead. But help was miles away, and every moment meant more of their cattle, their livelihood, disappearing. The rustlers had a head start, but they were slowed by driving the cattle. Eleanor pushed Samson harder, grateful for the hours Jacob had spent teaching her to ride. The big horse's stride ate up the ground, his powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath her. As she drew closer, she could make out details. 5 men, bandanas covering their faces, expertly herding about 30 head of cattle. One rider lagged behind, watching their back trail. He spotted her first, shouting a warning to the others. Eleanor raised the rifle, fighting to steady it against Samson's motion. She fired, not aiming to kill, but to warn. The shot cracked across the valley like a whip. The rustler's response was immediate and violent. 2 riders peeled off from the herd, turning back toward her. Eleanor saw the glint of drawn pistols and felt her first real stab of fear. She'd been foolish, driven by anger and adrenaline. Now she was alone, outnumbered, and they were closing fast. She wheeled Samson toward a cluster of rocks, seeking cover. Bullets whined past, one so close she felt the wind of its passage. She slid from the saddle as they reached the rocks, using Samson's body as a shield while she found better position. The Spencer held 7 rounds. She'd fired 1, 6 left. Her hands were steady as she sighted on the nearest rider. Jacob's voice echoed in her memory. "Aim center mass. Squeeze. Don't pull." She fired. The rustler jerked but stayed in the saddle, clutching his shoulder. His companion returned fire, rock chips exploding near Eleanor's face. She ducked, worked the rifle's lever, came up firing again. This time, she saw the rustler's horse go down. The man rolled clear, scrambling for cover. But Eleanor's position was poor. They'd flank her soon. That's when she heard it. Hoofbeats from the north. Hope and fear warred in her chest. Friend or foe? "Eleanor," Jacob's voice, raw with fear and fury. She'd never heard him sound like that, not even when facing down Dalton. He came over the rise like an avenging angel. Tom Morrison and 2 other ranchers with him, the rustlers, caught between Eleanor's position and the arriving riders, made a desperate choice. They abandoned the stolen cattle, spurring their horses toward the canyon. But one rustler, the one Eleanor had wounded, wasn't fast enough. His horse, laboring under his weight and his injury, fell behind. Tom Morrison's lasso snaked out, catching him clean. He hit the ground hard and didn't get up. Jacob reached Eleanor first, sliding from his horse before it had fully stopped. His hands were on her shoulders, her arms, her face, checking for injuries with frantic intensity. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice shook. "Jacob, I'm fine." "Fine." His gray eyes were wild. "You could have been killed. What were you thinking, taking on 5 armed men alone?" "I was thinking about our cattle," Eleanor shot back, adrenaline making her sharp. "I was thinking about our ranch, our future." Jacob crushed her to his chest, cutting off her words. She could feel him trembling, could hear his heart hammering against her ear. "Don't," he said roughly. Don't you ever, God, Eleanor, when I saw you pinned down. But I wasn't alone, she said into his shirt. You came. I almost didn't make it in time. His arms tightened around her. We were heading back from patrol when we heard the shots. If we'd been 5 minutes later, but you weren't. Eleanor pulled back enough to look up at him. We're partners, remember? We protect what's ours. Tom Morrison cleared his throat, reminding them they had an audience. Hate to interrupt, but we got ourselves a prisoner to deal with. And I reckon it's time we had that proof we've been needing. The captured rustler, blood seeping through his shirt from Eleanor's bullet, turned out to be Chuck Garrett, one of Dalton's longtime hands. Faced with the prospect of hanging for cattle theft and the attempted murder of a woman, he broke like a dam. It was all Dalton, he gasped out. Tom Morrison's boot on his chest and 4 rifles pointed at his head. He's been organizing the raids, using that box canyon on his property to hide the stolen cattle until he can rebrand them. Will you testify to that in court? Jacob demanded. Garrett's laugh was bitter. I testify. I'm dead either way. But yeah, I'll talk. Better to hang legal than get shot in the back by Dalton. They tied Garrett across his saddle and headed for town, the recovered cattle trailing behind. Eleanor rode beside Jacob, still shaking from the aftermath of violence. She'd shot a man, granted. She'd aimed to wound, not kill, but the reality of it sat heavy in her stomach. You did what you had to, Jacob said quietly, reading her mood. You protected what was ours. No shame in that. I know, and she did know. Intellectually, but knowing and feeling were different things. It's just, in Philadelphia, the most dangerous thing I ever did was attend a suffragette meeting in secret. This isn't Philadelphia. His voice was gentle but firm. Out here, sometimes violence is the only language men like Dalton understand. The ride to Cedar Ridge took on the quality of a parade as other ranchers joined them, words spreading like wildfire about the captured rustler and his confession. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, half the town had gathered. Sheriff Watson, a tired-looking man in his 60s who'd been content to look the other way for too long, suddenly found his spine when faced with an angry mob of ranchers and a bleeding prisoner willing to confess. I'll need statements from everyone, he said, trying to assert authority. And someone should ride to the county seat. Get the circuit judge. Already sent a rider. Tom Morrison interrupted. Judge will be here tomorrow. Question is, Sheriff, what are you going to do about Dalton? The sheriff's face was a study in discomfort. Now, Tom, we can't just go arresting Mr. Dalton on the word of his own hired hand? Jacob stepped forward, and Eleanor saw the other ranchers straighten, recognizing leadership. Sheriff, 2 boys are dead. Our cattle have been stolen. We have a witness. What more do you need? The crowd rumbled agreement. Sheriff Watson, perhaps recognizing which way the wind was blowing, nodded reluctantly. All right, I'll deputize some men. Ride out to the Double D. We'll all ride, Tom Morrison said flatly. Make sure nothing happens to our witness between now and tomorrow. And so it was that Eleanor found herself part of a 30-rider posse, heading for Dalton's ranch as the sun began its descent. She'd changed her torn and dusty dress for fresh clothes, but kept the rifle across her saddle. The Double D was everything Jacob's modest ranch wasn't, a sprawling complex of buildings, corrals full of horses, and pastures thick with cattle. Too many cattle, Eleanor realized, for the land Dalton legally owned. Dalton himself emerged from the main house as they approached, flanked by a dozen of his men. He was dressed like a cattle baron from a dime novel. Silver spurs, pearl-handled pistols, a vest that probably cost more than most families saw in a year. Sheriff Watson, he said smoothly, ignoring the armed ranchers. To what do I owe the pleasure? Frank Dalton, you're under arrest for cattle rustling and conspiracy to commit murder. The sheriff's voice shook slightly, but he got the words out. You'll come peaceful-like, or what? Dalton's smile was cold. You'll have 30 ranchers shoot it out with my boys? How many widows you want to make today, Sheriff? It was Jacob who spoke, his voice carrying clearly. "Look at your men. Dalton, look at them close. They're hired guns, loyal to your money. These ranchers, they're fighting for their homes, their families. You really want to test which motivation is stronger?" For a long moment, the tableau held two groups of armed men, fingers hovering near triggers, death hanging in the air like smoke. Then one of Dalton's men, older and apparently wiser, slowly raised his hands. "I didn't sign on for no massacre," he said. "Not for $40 a month." Others followed suit, the solidarity of hired guns crumbling in the face of determined opposition. Dalton's face went from confident to cornered as his support evaporated. "You're making a mistake," he snarled as the sheriff moved in with shackles. "I own half this valley." "You stole half this valley," Eleanor corrected, spurring forward. "But that ends today." Dalton's eyes fixed on her with pure hatred. "You, Hart's wild woman. This is your doing, turning him against—" "No," Jacob interrupted, moving his horse to shield Eleanor. "This is your doing, Dalton. Your greed, your violence. You pushed too far, hurt too many people. Did you really think we'd just keep taking it?" As they led Dalton away, Eleanor noticed Mrs. Davies and her circle of proper ladies watching from the general store porch. Their expressions were unreadable, but when Eleanor met their eyes, Mrs. Davies gave a tiny nod. Perhaps not approval, but acknowledgement. The ride back to the ranch was subdued despite their victory. Justice would still need to be done. A trial held. The stolen cattle sorted and returned. But the immediate threat was over. As they unsaddled the horses in their barn, Jacob caught Eleanor's hand. "What you did today was foolish, I know. Was brave." He cupped her face in his hands. "Foolish too, but brave. When I saw you facing down those rustlers—" He shook his head. "I realized something." Eleanor's heart beat faster. "What?" "That all my rules, all my careful distance, it was worthless. Because if I'd lost you today—" His thumb traced her cheekbone. "I love you, Eleanor. Not the idea of a wife, not the help around the ranch. You, your wild beauty, your fierce heart, your refusal to be anything but yourself." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. "Jacob!" "I know I'm not what you probably dreamed of," he continued. "I'm just a rancher, rough-handed and set in my ways. But if you'll have me, truly have me—" Eleanor silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her answer into the touch of her lips on his when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. She smiled through her tears. "You beautiful, foolish man," she said. "I've been yours since the day you stood up to Dalton for me. Maybe since the moment you said I wasn't what you expected." "Thank God for that," Jacob murmured, pulling her close again. "Thank God you shattered every expectation." They stood there in the barn, holding each other as the last light faded from the sky. Outside, the ranch settled into evening, cattle lowing, horses nickering, the eternal whisper of wind through grass. But inside, two hearts beat as one, having found in each other not what they'd expected, but what they needed. The frontier had tested them with drought and violence, with social censure and physical danger, but they'd stood together, fought together, and won together. And in that victory, they'd found something more precious than safety or acceptance. They'd found home in each other. As they walked hand in hand toward the house, their home, Eleanor thought about the girl who'd boarded a train in Philadelphia, running from one life toward another. That girl had wanted freedom, independence, a chance to be herself. She'd found all that and more. She'd found a partner who valued her strength, a life that challenged her daily, and a love that made every hardship worthwhile. The frontier had shaped her, marked her, changed her in ways she was still discovering. But as Jacob opened the door to their home, as he smiled at her with those gray eyes full of love and promise, Eleanor knew she wouldn't change a single moment of the journey that had brought her here. She was exactly where she belonged. The trial of Frank Dalton had concluded 2 weeks ago with a guilty verdict, sending ripples of change through the valley. Some of his ill-gotten lands were being redistributed to the families he'd wronged. and a new peace had settled over the ranching community. But in the town of Cedar Ridge, another kind of trial was underway, one that took place not in a courtroom but in parlors and over store counters, where Eleanor Hart was being judged by a jury of her peers. The whispers had grown louder since the rustler incident. Eleanor heard them everywhere, at the general store, after church services, even from riders passing by their ranch. Unwomanly, they said. Improper. And worse. What kind of example is she setting? It came to a head on a crisp November morning when Eleanor rode into town for supplies. She'd dressed carefully, knowing eyes would be on her, a riding skirt that was practical but modest, her hair properly pinned despite its tendency to rebel. But she'd refused to abandon the split skirt design that allowed her to ride astride, or the boots that were sensible for ranch work. As she tied Pepper to the hitching post outside Hendrick's store, she noticed an unusual cluster of women on the boardwalk. Mrs. Davy stood at their center, holding court like a queen among her subjects. Mrs. Hart. Mrs. Davies called out, her voice carrying clearly. How fortuitous. We were just discussing you. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. Mrs. Davies, ladies, we've been having a conversation about the influence certain behaviors might have on our impressionable young ladies. Mrs. Davies's smile was sharp as a razor. Why, just yesterday, I caught my own Margaret trying to ride astride, claiming that if Mrs. Hart could do it, why couldn't she? A murmur ran through the gathered women. Eleanor recognized several faces, the banker's wife, the schoolmarm, even Mrs. Morrison. Though she looked uncomfortable with the proceedings. I fail to see the harm in a girl learning to ride properly, Eleanor said evenly, especially in a land where riding might one day save her life. Properly? Mrs. Davies's eyebrows rose. Is that what you call it? And I suppose you also think it's proper for a woman to chase after rustlers with a rifle, endangering herself and forcing men to risk their lives rescuing her? Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks. I was protecting our property, and I didn't need rescuing. I was holding my own when help arrived. Holding your own? The words dripped disdain. This is exactly the problem. Mrs. Hart, you seem to believe that a woman should act like a man, dress like a man, work like a man. What next? Shall we have women voting, running for office, abandoning their God-given roles entirely? If their God-given intelligence suits them for it, why not? The words were out before Eleanor could stop them. The gathered women gasped as if she'd uttered blasphemy. Perhaps, in their world, she had, you see? Mrs. Davies addressed her audience. This is what comes of allowing standards to slip. One woman decides she's above the natural order, and suddenly we have chaos. She turned back to Eleanor. I'm afraid we must insist that you conform to proper frontier standards, Mrs. Hart, for the good of the community. And if I don't, then perhaps you'll find that this community can be unwelcoming to those who refuse to respect its values. The threat was clear. Social ostracism, boycotts, isolation, on the frontier, where neighbors depended on each other for survival. Such tactics could be devastating. Eleanor felt anger rise in her throat like bile. She'd faced down her father, survived the journey west, helped capture rustlers. She wouldn't be cowed by small-minded gossips. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Henrietta. Mrs. Morrison stepped forward, separating herself from the group. Tom Morrison's wife was a sturdy woman in her 50s, weathered by frontier life but still strong. She'd lost a son to Dalton's violence, and the grief had marked her, but hadn't broken her. Sarah, Mrs. Davies said coolly, surely you don't approve of a woman defending her home? Of a wife working beside her husband to build something worthwhile? Mrs. Morrison's voice grew stronger. My William is dead because we didn't stand up to bullies soon enough. If Eleanor Hart had been a bit less proper and a bit more willing to fight, maybe my boy would still be alive. That's hardly... And you, Mrs. Morrison turned to face the other women. How many of you have ridden astride when necessity called? How many have taken up a rifle when your men were away? How many have done unwomanly things to keep your families fed and safe? Several women shifted uncomfortably. The banker's wife looked away. The frontier demands more of us than tea parties and needlework. Mrs. Morrison continued. It always has. Eleanor Hart just has the courage to admit it openly instead of pretending otherwise. She looked directly at Eleanor. I'll take honest strength over hypocritical weakness any day. With that, she marched into the store, leaving stunned silence in her wake. One by one, other women began to drift away, some following Mrs. Morrison, others trailing after Mrs. Davies, who was sputtering with indignation. Eleanor found her hands shaking as she entered the store. Mrs. Morrison was at the counter, calmly listing her needs to a bemused Mr. Hendricks. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly. Mrs. Morrison glanced at her. No need for thanks. I spoke the truth, is all. Though I reckon you've made an enemy today. Henrietta Davies doesn't forget slights. I've survived worse than social disapproval. Have you? Mrs. Morrison's eyes were knowing. It's one thing to face down rustlers, dear. It's another to be slowly frozen out by every woman in town. To have no one to talk to when your man's away. No one to help when babies come. No one to share the burdens that only women understand. Eleanor felt the truth of that settle in her stomach like lead. She'd been so focused on proving herself capable of a man's work that she'd forgotten the importance of women's community on the frontier. Still, Mrs. Morrison continued, adding flour to her order. Change has to start somewhere. My mother scandalized her community by learning to read. I scandalized mine by teaching school before I married. Maybe it's your turn to push boundaries. When Eleanor returned to the ranch, she found Jacob in the near pasture, working with a young horse. He took one look at her face and abandoned the training session. What happened? Eleanor told him about the confrontation, trying to keep her voice steady. But when she reached Mrs. Davies's threat of social ostracism, her composure cracked. Maybe she's right, she said, sinking onto the porch step. Maybe I am too disruptive. You don't need a wife who brings trouble. Stop. Jacob sat beside her, taking her hands. Just stop. But Jacob, if the whole town turns against us, then we'll manage. His gray eyes were steady. Eleanor, do you think I care what Henrietta Davies thinks? Do you think her approval matters more to me than having a partner who can ride and shoot and work beside me? It's not just about her approval. It's about community. Belonging. We have community. Jacob interrupted. Tom and Sarah Morrison, the Baxters, the other ranchers who've seen your courage and respect it. Not everyone in town agrees with Mrs. Davies, even if they're too cowed to say so publicly. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. What if I'm wrong? What if the way I am really is harmful? Jacob turned her to face him fully. The way you are saved our cattle. The way you are helped bring Dalton to justice. The way you are. He paused, searching for words. Eleanor, before you came, I was existing, not living, following all the rules, maintaining all the standards, and dying inside bit by bit. You didn't just shatter my expectations, you brought me back to life. Jacob, I mean it. His hands cupped her face. Your wild beauty, your refusal to be less than you are, your courage. That's what tamed my soul. Not by making me weak, but by reminding me what it means to be truly alive. Don't let small-minded people make you doubt your worth. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. But what if... He silenced her with a kiss, deep and sure. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. No what-ifs. We face whatever comes together. That's what partners do. Over the following days, the effects of the confrontation became clear. Some women pointedly crossed the street to avoid Eleanor. The invitation to the church social gathering was conspicuously not extended. When she entered the general store, conversation stopped, but there were other reactions too. Young Margaret Davies appeared at their ranch one afternoon, ostensibly lost but clearly curious. Eleanor found her attempting to mount Pepper in the barn. I could teach you, Eleanor offered quietly, if your parents approved. Margaret's face fell. They won't, Mother says you're a bad influence. And what do you think? The girl, maybe 15, on the cusp of womanhood, bit her lip. I think you're brave. I think I want to be brave too. Eleanor chose her words carefully. Bravery isn't about defying your parents, Margaret, but it might mean having honest conversations with them about who you want to become. After Margaret left, Eleanor found 2 fresh-baked pies on their porch. No note, but she recognized Mrs. Baxter's distinctive crust, small gestures of support, delivered quietly. The test came a week later. One of their mares went into difficult labor in the middle of the night. Jacob was with a distant section of the herd, checking on water sources. Eleanor was alone, and the mare was in trouble. She needed help, experienced help. The nearest was Sarah Morrison, who delivered more foals than anyone in the valley, but asking meant potentially facing rejection, being turned away in her hour of need. Eleanor saddled Pepper and rode hard through the darkness. When she pounded on the Morrison door, it was Tom who answered, rifle in hand until he recognized her. Eleanor, what's wrong? Bella's foaling. She's in trouble. I need Sarah. Tom didn't hesitate. Sarah, get your kit. Sarah Morrison emerged already dressing, her graying hair in a hasty braid. How long has she been laboring? 3 hours. The foal's positioned wrong, I think. Then we'd best hurry. They rode back together, Sarah asking pointed questions about the mare's condition. In the barn, she took charge immediately, examining the struggling animal with expert hands. You're right, it's breech. We'll need to turn it. She looked at Eleanor. Ever done this before? No? Then tonight you learn. Wash your hands in that carbolic solution. This is going to be messy. For the next 2 hours, they worked together to save mare and foal. Sarah's steady instruction and Eleanor's determination made a good team. When the foal finally slid free, alive and breathing, both women were exhausted, blood-stained, and triumphant. There, Sarah said, watching the wobbly colt find his feet. Nothing quite like new life to put things in perspective. As they cleaned up, Sarah spoke quietly. You know Henrietta's organizing a formal petition, asking the church board to censure you, maybe even ban you from services. Eleanor's heart sank. I see. Do you? Sarah turned to face her. Because I don't think you understand how afraid she is. Henrietta Davies built her entire life on being the perfect frontier wife, following every rule, never stepping out of line. And here you come, breaking those rules and thriving. You're living proof that her sacrifices might have been unnecessary. I never meant to. I know. Sarah's smile was sad. Change is hard, Eleanor, for those enforcing the old ways and those blazing new ones. But that colt there, he's alive because you weren't too proud to ask for help, and I wasn't too prejudiced to give it. Maybe that's how we move forward, one necessary moment at a time. When Jacob returned at dawn, he found Eleanor and Sarah sharing coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the mesas gold. Heard you had some excitement, he said, kissing Eleanor's temple. We saved the foal, Eleanor said. Together. Good neighbors do that, Sarah said, rising to leave. Help each other, regardless of whether they wear trousers or skirts. She paused at the porch steps. That church board meeting is Tuesday. Might be some of us will have things to say in your defense. Eleanor Hart might be more than Henrietta expects. After she left, Jacob pulled Eleanor close. You see, community isn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It's about people choosing to stand together despite their differences. Eleanor leaned into his warmth, watching the new colt explore the corral on unsteady legs. Change was indeed hard, she reflected. But like birth, sometimes it was necessary, painful, and ultimately beautiful. Do you think I should go? She asked. To the church meeting. Do you want to? Eleanor considered. Part of her wanted to hide, to avoid the confrontation, but a larger part, the part that had brought her west, that had faced down rustlers and won her husband's heart, refused to cower. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'll go, in my split skirt and practical boots. They can accept me as I am or not, but I won't pretend to be something I'm not." Jacob's arms tightened around her. "That's my wild beauty," he murmured. "Facing down the church board with the same courage you faced those rustlers." "Well," Eleanor said with a slight smile, "at least the church board is less likely to shoot at me." "Don't be too sure," Jacob said dryly. "Henrietta Davies might surprise you." They laughed together as the sun climbed higher, illuminating a world where change came slowly but inevitably. Like water carving new channels through ancient stone, the frontier was transforming, one brave soul at a time. And Eleanor Hart, for all the controversy she caused, was part of that transformation. She'd found her place, not by conforming to it, but by having the courage to reshape it, one improper act at a time. The drought began subtly, with morning dews that disappeared too quickly and afternoon skies that remained stubbornly, brilliantly blue. By late November, what should have been the start of winter rains had become an extension of autumn's dry breath. The grass, usually storing strength for the cold months, crackled brown beneath their feet. Eleanor first noticed the change in the creek, where water usually ran clear and strong. The flow had diminished to a worried trickle. She stood at its edge one December morning, watching Jacob examine the water level with grim concentration. "It's dropped 2 feet in the last month," he said, not needing to explain the implications. Water was life on the frontier, even more than bullets or determination. "The winter rains will come," Eleanor said, though she heard the question in her own voice. "Maybe." Jacob's gray eyes scanned the cloudless horizon. "But if they don't, or if they're late..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. By Christmas, a quiet affair marked more by worry than celebration, the situation had worsened. The creek that had convinced Jacob to choose this land ran so low that pools of stagnant water formed between exposed rocks. The cattle grew gaunt, ranging farther each day in search of grass that simply wasn't there. Other ranchers were suffering too. Tom Morrison rode over on a particularly harsh day, his usual hearty demeanor replaced by deep concern. "Lost 5 head yesterday," he reported. Accepting the cup of coffee Eleanor offered. "Just laid down and couldn't get up again." "How are you folks managing?" "Still holding on," Jacob replied. "But if we don't get rain soon..." Johnson's already given up, selling his herd for pennies on the dollar and heading back east. Tom's weathered face looked older than his years. "Can't say I blame him. Sarah keeps saying maybe we should consider it too." Eleanor felt something cold grip her heart. If established ranchers like the Morrisons were considering leaving, what hope did she and Jacob have? After Tom left, she found Jacob standing by the barn, staring at their diminished herd. Without speaking, she slipped her hand into his. His fingers tightened around hers, seeking and offering comfort. "We'll find a way," she said softly. "Will we?" For the first time since she'd known him, Jacob sounded defeated. "Eleanor, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking." Her voice was firm. "I'm choosing." "We're partners, remember? For better or worse." He turned to her then, and she saw the fear he'd been hiding, not for himself, but for her. "This isn't what I promised you. A failing ranch, dying cattle. You promised me a life," Eleanor interrupted. "A real life, with real challenges. Did you think I expected it to be easy?" "I expected to be able to provide for my wife," Jacob said roughly. "Not watch her grow thin with worry and work while everything dies around us." Eleanor reached up, framing his face with her work-roughened hands. "Jacob Hart, you listen to me. I didn't marry you for security. I married you for this, for facing whatever comes together. Now stop wallowing and help me figure out what we're going to do." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." They spent the evening poring over maps and land records, searching for any advantage they might have missed. It was Eleanor who spotted it, a notation on an old survey map that showed their property extending farther into the northern hills than they'd realized. "What's up there?" she asked, pointing to the marked area. Jacob frowned. "Rocky country, Too rough for grazing. I've never explored it much. But if there's rough country, there might be springs, hidden water sources. Hope flickered in Jacob's eyes. It's possible. The geology... He stopped, studying the map more closely. There's a canyon marked here. If water flows anywhere during drought, it would pool in low places like that. They set out at dawn the next day, leaving Boss and Lady to guard the ranch. The journey into the hills was treacherous, following game trails that switched back through increasingly rough terrain. Eleanor's sure-footed Pepper proved her worth, picking her way carefully over loose shale and around fallen boulders. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. Their water supply, carefully rationed, grew warm and stale. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through passages too narrow and steep to ride. Maybe we should turn back, Jacob said as they paused to rest the horses. I won't risk you for a possibility. So, we've come this far, Eleanor argued, though her throat was parched and her body ached. Just a little farther. They pressed on, the landscape growing more desolate with each mile. Eleanor began to think Jacob was right. This was foolishness, desperation driving them to chase mirages. Then Pepper's ears pricked forward, and the mare nickered softly. She smells something. Eleanor breathed. They followed the horse's instincts now, letting them pick the path. The animals moved with increasing purpose, navigating a narrow defile between two towering red rocks. And then, like a miracle, the canyon opened before them. It was an hidden oasis carved by centuries of water flow. At its heart, fed by some underground source, a pool of clear water reflected the sky. Grass, actual green grass, grew in scattered patches where soil had collected in rocky crevices. Desert willows provided shade, their roots deep enough to find moisture even in drought. "My God," Jacob whispered. "It's beautiful." Eleanor slid from Pepper's back, her legs shaky with relief and exhaustion. She knelt by the pool, cupping water in her hands, tasting its cool sweetness. When she looked up, she found Jacob watching her with an expression of wonder that had nothing to do with their discovery. "What?" she asked. "You." He dismounted and came to kneel beside her. "Your faith when I had none. Your refusal to give up. You found this, Eleanor. You saved us." "We found it," she corrected. "Together." They explored the canyon thoroughly, finding several springs feeding the main pool. The water flow wasn't enormous, but it was steady, enough to sustain a portion of their herd through the worst of the drought. "We can't move all the cattle here," Jacob calculated. "The canyon won't support that many, but if we rotate them, bring up the weakest first. And we can haul water back to the ranch." Eleanor added, "It will be hard work, but we'll survive." Jacob pulled her close, right there by the life-saving pool. "We'll survive because of you." "Because of us," Eleanor insisted. But she was smiling. The next weeks were the hardest of Eleanor's life. They worked from dawn to past dusk, creating a rough trail to the canyon that cattle could navigate. They built temporary holding pens from deadfall and brush. They hauled water in every container they could find, making the treacherous journey sometimes twice a day. Eleanor's hands bled from rope burns. Her back screamed from lifting water barrels. She grew lean and brown as leather. Her beauty transformed from Philadelphia polish to something harder and truer. And through it all, she never complained, never suggested they give up. Word of their discovery spread carefully through the valley, shared only with trusted neighbors who were also struggling. The Morrisons brought their weakest cattle. The Baxters followed. A small community of survival formed, centered around the hidden water. Mrs. Davies and her social circle heard about it. Of course, they arrived one day while Eleanor was helping repair a holding pen, her split skirt tied up to keep it from the mud, her hair escaping its pins to curl wildly around her sweaty face. "Well," Mrs. Davies said, surveying the scene with obvious distaste. "I see standards have fallen even farther than I thought." Eleanor straightened, pushing hair from her eyes with a muddy hand. "Mrs. Davies, have you come to water cattle?" "Hardly." The woman's laugh was brittle. I came to see if the rumors were true, that Jacob Hart's wife was laboring like a rancher. Eleanor interrupted. Like someone fighting to save her home and help her neighbors, which is what I am. You're making a spectacle of yourself. Mrs. Davies's voice rose. What kind of example? She was cut off by the arrival of her own husband, his prize bull in tow. Mr. Davies, a practical man who'd let his wife rule the social sphere while he focused on business, touched his hat to Eleanor. Mrs. Hart, heard you folks found water, wondering if we might negotiate access. I'll pay. Of course. Eleanor glanced at Jacob, who nodded slightly. They'd discussed this. Survival trumped social feuds. No payment necessary. Eleanor said, neighbors help each other in hard times. Bring what cattle need water most. We'll work out a rotation. Mr. Davies's relief was visible. That's right generous of you, considering... He glanced at his wife, whose face had gone red. Considering what? Eleanor asked innocently. That your wife has made it her mission to ostracize me, that's her choice, Mr. Davies. But I won't let social grudges condemn innocent animals. You can't seriously mean to... Mrs. Davies began. Henrietta, her husband said quietly. These folks are offering to save our stock. Maybe it's time to reconsider some things. The look Mrs. Davies gave Eleanor could have scorched earth, but she said nothing more, standing rigid while her husband made arrangements for water access. As they prepared to leave, young Margaret slipped away from her mother's side. Thank you, she whispered to Eleanor, for showing me. Showing you what? That there's more than one way to be a woman. The girl glanced back at her mother. That strength isn't unladylike. That night, as Eleanor and Jacob finally returned to their ranch, exhausted beyond measure, they found their table laden with food, pies, preserved meats, canned vegetables, contributions from grateful neighbors. Looks like we have more friends than we knew, Jacob observed, pulling Eleanor onto his lap despite their mutual filthiness. Or fewer enemies, Eleanor murmured against his neck. Did you see Mrs. Davies's face? I did. His arms tightened around her. You could have refused them. No one would have blamed you. And become like her? No. Eleanor pulled back to meet his eyes. I came west to be free, not to build new cages of spite. Jacob studied her face, thinner now, marked by sun and work, but somehow more beautiful for its strength. You humble me, he said softly. Every day, you humble me. I'm too tired to be humble. Eleanor confessed. I just want a bath and 12 hours of sleep. He laughed, the sound rich in the dim kitchen. I'll haul water for a bath. You've earned it. As he worked, Eleanor sat by the window, watching the stars appear in the drought-clear sky. They'd found water, but the drought was far from over. There would be more struggles, more losses. The ranch might still fail, but tonight, with their neighbors' gifts on the table and their cattle drinking from hidden springs, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected. Not just hope, but certainty. They would survive this. Together. They would survive anything. The water's ready, Jacob called. Eleanor rose, wincing at her sore muscles. At the bedroom door, she paused. Jacob, thank you. For the bath? For believing in me? For letting me be who I am, even when it causes talk. He crossed to her, tipping her chin up. Eleanor, you've taught me something important. Rules, expectations. What others think. None of it matters next to truth. And the truth is, your wild beauty didn't just shatter my rules. It saved my life. Literally now, with that water. But more than that, it saved my soul from dying of thirst long before this drought began. Eleanor kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into the touch. When they parted, she smiled. We saved each other. Then, seems fair. As she bathed, washing away the day's dirt and sweat, Eleanor thought about the hidden canyon with its precious water. It was like love. She realized, something that sustained you through the hardest times, but only if you were brave enough to search for it in unlikely places. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Probably another false promise. They'd had several such teases, but Eleanor found herself hoping anyway. Hope, like water in the desert, was precious and necessary. And sometimes, if you had faith enough to keep searching, it led you to exactly what you needed to survive. The rains finally came on a February morning, arriving not as the gentle shower they'd prayed for, but as a deluge that seemed determined to make up for months of absence. Eleanor woke to the sound of it hammering on the roof, a rhythmic drumming that pulled her from dreams into glorious reality. "Jacob," she shook his shoulder, her voice high with excitement. "Listen." He was already awake, lying still as if afraid movement might break the spell. "Rain," he whispered, the word holding all the reverence of a prayer. They dressed hastily and rushed onto the porch, spreading their arms wide to catch the drops. The parched earth drank greedily, sending up the distinctive scent of petrichor that made Eleanor's heart soar. In the distance, she could hear the creek beginning to sing again as runoff found its way home. "We made it," Jacob said, pulling her against him as they watched the desert bloom back to life. "We survived. Together," Eleanor murmured, thinking of all they'd endured. The drought, the social ostracism, the back-breaking work of hauling water. We survived together. The rains continued for 3 days, transforming the valley from brown desolation to verdant promise. Grass seed that had lain dormant sprouted with eager intensity. The cattle, grown thin but tough through their ordeal, began to fill out again. Even the people of Cedar Ridge seemed renewed, their faces losing the pinched look of worry that drought brings. It was during this renewal that Mrs. Davies appeared at their ranch, alone and looking distinctly uncomfortable. Eleanor, who'd been working in a restored garden, straightened warily as the woman approached. "Mrs. Hart." Mrs. Davies began, then stopped, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily. "I owe you a debt." Eleanor said nothing, waiting. "My husband told me how you saved our cattle, how you offered water freely despite my behavior." The older woman's face was rigid with the effort of humility. "I was wrong. About you. About what matters out here." "Were you?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Mrs." Davies looked at her directly for perhaps the first time. "When I came west as a bride 30 years ago, I was terrified. The only way I could cope was to recreate the rules I knew, to impose order on chaos. But you—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "You found another way. A braver way." Eleanor felt her animosity beginning to soften. "We all survive as best we can, Mrs. Davies." "Yes." The woman straightened her shoulders. "Which is why I've come to tell you that I've withdrawn my petition to the church board, and to ask if you might teach Margaret to ride, properly, the way you do." The olive branch hung between them, unexpected and precious. Eleanor smiled. "I'd be honored." As Mrs. Davies left, head high but burden lifted, Jacob emerged from the barn where he'd been tactfully giving them privacy. "Did I just see Henrietta Davies humble herself?" he asked, wonder in his voice. "You saw a woman changing," Eleanor corrected. "It's not easy, breaking the rules we set for ourselves." Jacob wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. Speaking of rules, his hand spread across her stomach, where the faintest swell had begun to show. "I suppose we'll have to make new ones soon." Eleanor covered his hand with hers, feeling the life growing within her, conceived during those desperate weeks of drought when they'd clung to each other and hope with equal fervor. "A child born of this land?" she said softly. "Born of struggle and survival and love. Our child," Jacob murmured. "As wild and beautiful as their mother, as steady as their father. Or perhaps," Eleanor turned in his arms, "wild and steady both. The frontier will need children who can be both." Spring arrived in full glory, painting the desert in colors Philadelphia's manicured gardens could never match. Wildflowers carpeted the hills where their cattle grazed. The hidden canyon remained their secret treasure. Now one of many water sources, but still special for what it had meant in their darkest hour. On a warm April evening, the ranch hosted a gathering, not the formal social events Mrs. Davies used to orchestrate, but something more genuine. Neighbors came to share food, stories, and gratitude for survival. Eleanor, now visibly pregnant, moved among them with easy grace, as comfortable discussing cattle prices with the men as she was sharing preserving techniques with the women. "Look at her," Sarah Morrison said to Jacob, nodding toward Eleanor as she taught Margaret Davies the proper way to hold a lasso. 6 months ago, half these people were calling her scandalous. Now they're seeking her advice. "She has that effect," Jacob said with quiet pride. "Makes people reconsider what they thought they knew." As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Tom Morrison called for attention. "Think we ought to acknowledge something," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "This winter could have broken us. Would have, if we'd all stuck to our old ways. But Eleanor Hart showed us something important, that strength comes in different forms, and that helping each other matters more than following rules about what's proper." He raised his glass of precious water, now abundant again. "To the Harts, for reminding us what frontier spirit really means." The toast was echoed warmly, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She'd come west seeking freedom and found so much more: love, community, purpose. Later, as the gathering wound down and guests began their journeys home under a canopy of stars, Eleanor and Jacob stood together on their porch. The night air was soft with spring warmth, carrying the scent of sage and new growth. "No regrets?" Jacob asked, his hand gentle on her swollen belly. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Her hands were no longer soft, her skin no longer porcelain pale. She'd faced drought and danger, social censure and killing work. She'd fired a rifle at rustlers and hauled water until her muscles screamed. She'd been called wild, improper, scandalous. "Not one," she said firmly. "This life, our life, it's everything I never knew I wanted." Jacob turned her to face him, his gray eyes soft in the moonlight. "That first day at the train station, I said you weren't what I expected. And now I know you were exactly what I needed, what we all needed." He kissed her gently. "Your wild beauty shattered every rule I'd built around my heart. And in doing so, you didn't just tame my soul, you set it free." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the frightened girl who'd boarded a train in Philadelphia, running from one life toward an uncertain future. That girl could never have imagined this, standing on a frontier porch, pregnant with the child of a man who valued her strength, surrounded by a community that had learned to see past convention to truth. "We set each other free," she said, leaning into his embrace, "and built something new from the pieces." As they stood together, looking out over their land, scarred by drought but healing, challenged but not broken, Eleanor felt the baby move within her. A new generation for a new frontier, one where strength could wear many faces and love could flourish in the most unlikely ground. The coyotes began their nightly chorus, no longer a sound of danger but of home. Boss and lady, gray around their muzzles now but still vigilant, settled into their guard positions. Inside the house, simple but filled with purpose, 2 lives had become 3, soon to be 4. The frontier had tested them with everything it had: drought and violence, prejudice and hardship. But they had met each test together, and in doing so, had forged something stronger than rules or expectations. They had forged a love as enduring as the land itself, as wild as the wind through the canyons, and as certain as the rain that always, eventually, returns to heal the earth. Thank you so much for joining me on this wild journey through the American frontier. I hope Eleanor and Jacob's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening to this tale of love and survival? Drop a comment below and let me know. I'd love to connect with fellow lovers of Wild West romance. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more stories of courage, passion, and the untamed spirit of the frontier. What did you think of Eleanor's transformation? How about Jacob learning to let love back into his heart? Share your thoughts. I read every comment and can't wait to hear from you.